boy stopped screaming on the third day, not because the pain lessened, not because he'd gotten used to the surgical modifications happening to his body. He stopped screaming because his vocal cords had been surgically removed as part of the osmodula implantation procedure. And now the only sound he could make was a wet, desperate gurgling that nobody bothered to acknowledge. His name had been Tomar, 10 years old, taken from a death world where children learned to hunt before they learned to speak. He'd survived the trials, beaten 300 other aspirants, proven himself worthy of becoming one of the Emperor's angels. He'd thought that meant glory, thought it meant honor, thought becoming a space marine was a reward for excellence. He'd been wrong about all of it. The apothecaries had explained the process during orientation. 19 separate surgeries over the course of several years. 19 new organs implanted into his body. Genetic modifications that would transform him from human into something greater, something stronger, something that could fight the galaxy's nightmares without flinching. They'd explained it clinically, efficiently, like reading a maintenance manual for a piece of equipment. Here are the organs. Here's what they do. Here are the survival rates for each procedure. They hadn't mentioned the pain. The months spent immobilized while your skeleton dissolved and reformed. The years of psychological conditioning that stripped away everything you'd been and replaced it with something designed to kill. The realization that you weren't becoming better, you were becoming other. Tomar lay strapped to the surgical slab, his chest split open, his ribcage held apart by metal clamps. He could feel the apothecaries working inside him, feel foreign tissue being grafted onto his organs, feel his body rejecting and accepting and transforming all at once. He couldn't scream, couldn't beg them to stop, couldn't do anything except exist in this state of controlled agony while strangers rebuilt him into a weapon. This was day 73 of his transformation. He had approximately 7 more years to go. 7 years of this. 7 years of surgical modification and chemical indoctrination and psychological conditioning. 7 years of dying slowly so something else could be born wearing his face. The apothecary leaning over him checked a data slate, made a note, adjusted something inside Tomar's chest cavity that sent fresh waves of agony through nerve endings that shouldn't still be functional. Implantation proceeding normally, the apothecary said to his assistant. Subject tolerance within acceptable parameters. Continue sedation at current levels. Subject. Not Tomar. Not even aspirant. Just subject. That's what he'd become. A body being processed. A raw material being shaped into something useful. Welcome to the Adeptus Astartes. Welcome to becoming an angel. Welcome to the life of a space marine. And the horror was just beginning. This is the story nobody wants to tell. The reality behind the propaganda. Before we go deeper into what actually happens to boys who become space marines, I need you to answer something honestly in the comments. Knowing what the process actually involves, the surgeries, the conditioning, the complete psychological reconstruction, would you still volunteer? Would you let them do this to you for a chance at becoming transhuman? Drop your answer. Let's see who actually understands what the price of becoming an angel really is. Now let me show you what happens to those boys. What they lose, what they gain, and why calling them heroes might be the cruelest lie the Imperium ever told. Year 1. The secondary heart. Tomar woke up different. His chest felt wrong. Not painful, the pain was constant now, just background noise, but wrong. Like something foreign had been installed where nothing should be. He tried to sit up. Failed. His body didn't respond properly. The apothecaries had explained this. Said the secondary heart would take months to integrate. That his cardiovascular system would fight the modification until enough time passed for the organ to become natural. Natural. That was the word they used. As if anything about this process was natural. A servitor brought him nutrient paste. He ate mechanically, no longer tasting it. The chemical conditioning had started 3 months ago. Drugs pumped directly into his bloodstream. Designed to suppress emotions, reduce attachment, make him more receptive to hypno-indoctrination. He could feel it working, could feel parts of himself disappearing. Memories of home fading like old photographs left in sunlight. Faces of family becoming indistinct. The boy named Tamar was being erased one neuron at a time. And nobody asked if he wanted this. Nobody checked if he'd changed his mind. Because it was already too late. Once you entered the transformation process, you either became an Astartes or you died. There was no third option. Subject Tomar 773. A voice said. The chaplain. Always the chaplain. Dressed in black, skull-faced helm reflecting fluorescent light. You're scheduled for hypno-indoctrination in 30 minutes. This session will focus on suppressing fear response and enhancing combat aggression. Do you have questions? Tomar tried to speak. Remembered his vocal cords were gone. Shook his head instead. Good. Fear is weakness. Fear is failure. Fear is death. You will learn to kill fear before it kills you. You will learn to embrace violence. You will learn that you are no longer human. You are becoming something beyond human. Something glorious. Something glorious. That's what they always said. Never something horrifying. Never something that required destroying a child to create a weapon. The hypno-indoctrination chamber was sterile white. Tomar was strapped into a chair, his head immobilized. Then the helmet descended, sealed over his skull, began pumping information directly into his brain at speeds that would have killed a normal human. Combat doctrine, enemy patterns, weapon specifications, chapter history, litanies of hate, prayers to the emperor. All of it forced into his consciousness whether he wanted it or not. But worse than the information was the conditioning underneath. The subliminal programming that rewired how he thought, how he felt, what he valued. They were teaching him to hate, to see enemies everywhere, to view mercy as weakness and compassion as failure, to understand that his purpose was violence and nothing else mattered. 6 hours. That's how long the session lasted. When they removed the helmet, Tomar couldn't remember who he'd been before, couldn't remember why he'd wanted to become a space marine, could only remember that he was being made into something important, something necessary, something that would kill until it died. Year 3. The Biscopia. Tomar stood 2 meters tall now. His muscles had grown beyond human proportion. The Biscopia implant was working perfectly, building layer after layer of enhanced tissue onto his frame. He was strong enough to crush steel with his bare hands, fast enough to dodge lasgun fire, tough enough to survive injuries that would kill a normal human instantly. He was also in constant pain. The accelerated muscle growth strained his ligaments. His bones ached as the osmodula reinforced them with ceramite compounds. His skin felt too tight, stretched over mass that kept increasing. But he'd been conditioned not to mention pain. Taught that pain was just data. Information to be acknowledged and ignored. Warriors didn't complain. Warriors endured. Today's training was live fire combat. 50 aspirants thrown into a mock battlefield with functioning weapons and permission to kill. Last 10 standing would advance to the next phase of training. The rest would die. And their gene seed would be harvested to create the next generation. That was the reality they didn't mention during recruitment. That most aspirants didn't become space marines. They became casualties. Resources. Raw material processed through a system that valued output over individuals. Tomar killed his first fellow aspirant at minute 12. The boy couldn't remember his name. The conditioning had started making everyone interchangeable. Came at him with a combat knife. Tomar reacted on instinct. Grabbed the knife arm, broke it, drove his own blade up through the ribcage and into the heart. The boy died fast. Tomar felt nothing about it. That should have been disturbing, should have registered as wrong. He'd just killed someone. Someone who'd been sleeping in the bunk next to his for 3 years. Someone who'd shared the same agonies and survived the same surgeries. But the conditioning made it meaningless. Made it just another combat action. Successful neutralization of hostile target. Move to next objective. By the end of the training exercise, Tomar had killed 7 aspirants. Survived with minor injuries. Ranked in the top 5 for combat efficiency. The chaplain praised him. Called him a worthy son of the chapter. Said he was becoming what the emperor needed. And Tomar felt pride. Actual pride. Not in being a good person. in being an effective killer. That's when he understood what was really happening. They weren't teaching him to be a warrior. They were teaching him to be a weapon. And weapons don't have emotions about what they kill. Year 5. The catalepsian node. Tomar hadn't slept in 3 months. The catalepsian node was functioning perfectly, allowing his brain to rest in sections while remaining conscious. He could go weeks without true sleep now, could remain alert and functional through conditions that would break a normal human sanity. It should have been liberating, should have felt like gaining time, gaining capability. Instead, it felt like losing something essential. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was escape, a brief period where you could stop being a weapon and just exist. Now there was no escape, just endless consciousness, endless training, endless conditioning, every moment spent being shaped into something the Imperium needed. The psychological effects were starting to show. Not in obvious ways, the conditioning suppressed that, but in subtle patterns. The way he viewed other humans as fragile things. The way violence felt natural and peace felt wrong. The way he could look at a child and calculate how many shots it would take to neutralize. "You're adapting well," the chaplain said during evaluation. "Your psycho-indoctrination scores are above average. The gene seed has integrated cleanly. You'll make a fine addition to the chapter." "Thank you, chaplain." Tomar's voice was back. The liman's ear had been implanted, along with modifications to his throat. He could speak now, but his voice was different, deeper, mechanically precise. Nothing like the child's voice he'd had 7 years ago. "Do you remember your life before becoming an aspirant?" Tomar tried to remember, couldn't. There were fragments, sensory impressions, but no coherent narrative, no sense of who he'd been. "No, chaplain." "Good. That person is dead. You're what came after, what rose from his corpse. You're an Astartes now, or nearly one. The final modifications will complete your transformation." "Will it hurt?" "Yes, more than anything you've experienced so far. The black carapace insertion is agonizing. Your entire skin will be replaced with neural interface tissue. You'll feel like you're being flayed alive from the inside out." The chaplain paused. "But you'll endure it, because that's what we do. We endure. We suffer. We die slowly so we can kill effectively. That's the trade. That's what being an Astartes means." Year 7. The black carapace. The boy who'd been Tomar ceased to exist completely on this day. The black carapace insertion took 19 hours. 19 hours of being conscious while his entire dermal layer was replaced with synthetic interface tissue. Feeling his skin dissolve. Feeling new tissue grow in its place. Feeling every nerve ending fire simultaneously in patterns that transcended what human brains were designed to process. He did scream during this procedure. Everyone did. Even the conditioning couldn't suppress that level of agony. It was too fundamental, too absolute. But the screaming was just noise. Just another data point the apothecaries monitored to ensure the procedure was progressing correctly. When it was done, when the black carapace had fully integrated, Tomar stood before a mirror. The thing looking back wasn't human. Not anymore. It was 7 feet tall, massively muscled, scarred from surgical modifications, eyes that could see in absolute darkness, skin that was more machine interface than flesh. It was a weapon, purpose-built, perfectly designed, ready for deployment, and somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of conditioning and genetic modification, the boy who'd been Tomar looked out through those inhuman eyes and screamed in a voice no one could hear. Because he understood now. Understood what had really happened. He hadn't become a space marine. He'd been killed. Murdered through surgery and conditioning. And something else had been built in his place. Something that wore his memories like a poorly fitting costume. Something that existed only to kill. The chaplain placed a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome to the chapter, brother. Your transformation is complete. You are Astartes now. You will serve the Emperor until you die. You will know no fear, no mercy, no hesitation. You are a weapon of humanity's survival." The thing that had been Tomar nodded, accepted this, because that's what it was built to do. And the boy trapped inside just screamed and screamed and screamed where nobody could hear him. 20 years after transformation. Battle of Genna's Reach. The warrior formerly known as Tomar, now battle brother Constantus of the Fifth Company, had killed 3,742 enemies since completing his transformation. He knew the exact number, could remember every kill, every face, every moment of violence enacted in the Emperor's name. His enhanced memory made forgetting impossible, made every death permanent in his consciousness. Normal humans would have gone insane from that kind of burden, would have collapsed under the weight of so much killing. But Constantus had been conditioned to process it differently, to view each kill as a success, a mission accomplished, nothing more meaningful than a tick on a checklist. Today's mission was simple: clear a chaos-held fortress, eliminate all hostile forces, secure the location for Imperial occupation. Standard operation. Nothing unusual, except Constantus was starting to notice things. Details the conditioning hadn't fully suppressed. Things that made him question whether standard operation was something he should be participating in. The fortress held maybe 3,000 cultists, former Imperial citizens who'd turned to chaos worship. Men, women, children, entire families who'd rejected the Emperor and embraced damnation. Standard protocol. Kill them all. No prisoners. No mercy. Chaos corruption was absolute. Anyone tainted had to be purged. But as Constantus moved through the corridors, bolter firing in controlled bursts, he saw something that penetrated the conditioning. Saw families huddled together. Saw parents trying to shield children. Saw people who looked terrified rather than corrupted. They looked human. They looked like they were just trying to survive. Brother Constantus, his squad leader voxed. You're slowing. Maintain kill tempo. Constantus fired. Killed a man holding a child. Both died. He moved on. The conditioning said this was necessary. That chaos corruption couldn't be tolerated. That mercy was weakness. But part of him, the part that remembered being a scared child on a surgical slab, wondered if maybe the conditioning was wrong. If maybe some kills weren't justified. He suppressed the thought. Kept killing. Because that's what he was made for. Because questioning orders was heresy. Because Space Marines didn't think about the ethics of violence. They just executed it. 3 hours later, the fortress was cleared. 3,000 cultists dead. 0 survivors. Mission accomplished. Constantus stood in the aftermath, surrounded by corpses. Surrounded by families he'd slaughtered. Surrounded by the proof that being an Astartes meant becoming very efficient at ending lives that might not have deserved ending. Something troubles you, brother? The chaplain approached. Always watching. Always evaluating for signs of corruption or weakness. No, chaplain. You hesitated during the operation. I reviewed your combat footage. Multiple instances where you could have fired but delayed. Target identification protocols. Constantus lied. Ensuring proper kill confirmation. Your kill ratio was still above acceptable standards. But I'm flagging you for additional conditioning. We can't have hesitation. Can't have doubt. You're a weapon, brother. Weapons don't question their use. Yes, chaplain. That night, or what passed for night in the ship's artificial cycles. Constantus stood in his quarters, staring at his armor. The sacred ceramite. The chapter iconography. The purity seals and honor markings. It was beautiful. It was functional. It was the physical manifestation of everything he'd become. It was also a cage. A shell that trapped whatever remained of the boy he'd been. A reminder that he'd been transformed into something that existed only to kill and die. And for the first time in 20 years, Constantus allowed himself to feel something the conditioning said was forbidden. Regret. Not for the enemies he'd killed, but for the boy he'd been. For Tomar, who'd wanted to become a hero and had instead become a weapon. Who'd thought being a space marine meant glory and had discovered it meant being reprogrammed into a killing machine that couldn't even remember why it had wanted this. The regret lasted maybe 30 seconds before the conditioning reasserted. Before the chemical implants in his brain flooded his system with suppressants. Before the hypno-indoctrination reframed the emotion as weakness. But those 30 seconds were enough. Enough to understand what had been stolen from him. Enough to realize that becoming an Astartes wasn't ascension. It was death, just slow, spread across years of surgery and conditioning, until nothing human remained. 50 years after transformation, the Long Watch, Battle Brother Constantus had been assigned to the Death Watch, taken from his chapter and sent to serve with Astartes from across the Imperium, fighting Xeno's threats in the darkest corners of the galaxy. It should have been an honor. The Death Watch only accepted the best, the most skilled, the most dedicated. Instead, it felt like exile, like being sent to a place where the killing never stopped, where there were no breaks between deployments, where you fought until you died because that's what weapons did. The Watch Fortress was quiet today, between missions, a rare moment where warriors could maintain equipment and process the constant violence. Constantus sat in the reclusium, supposedly praying, actually just existing, trying to find some meaning in a life that had become nothing but endless combat. You've been staring at that shrine for 3 hours, brother. Another Deathwatch Marine. Blood Angel from the iconography. If you're not praying, what are you doing? Remembering. Remembering what? Being human. The Blood Angel sat beside him. Dangerous thoughts. We're not human anymore. Haven't been for decades. Trying to remember what we were is just torture. Do you ever wonder if we made a mistake? Constantus asked. If maybe becoming Astartes wasn't worth what we gave up? Every day. But wondering doesn't change anything. We're what we are. Can't go back. Can only move forward until something finally kills us. How long have you served? 137 years. I fought in 419 major engagements. Killed more things than I can count. And I can barely remember the boy I was before transformation. Do you miss him? The Blood Angel was silent for a long moment. Yes, I miss not being designed for violence. Miss being able to look at a civilian without automatically calculating kill vectors. Miss sleep. Real sleep, not the half-conscious state our nodes force on us. Miss being small enough to feel safe in enclosed spaces instead of trapped. But we can't say these things. Can't admit we regret this. Because that would be weakness. That would be failure. Exactly. So we endure. We kill. We pretend we chose this freely. And we try not to think about what we lost. A Vox alert interrupted them. New deployment. Tyrannid infestation on a mining world. Estimated enemy forces in the millions. Deathwatch response. 20 Marines. 20 Marines against millions of Tyrannids. The math was suicide. But they'd do it anyway. Because that's what they were made for. Because Space Marines didn't refuse missions. Because dying in combat was preferable to surviving and having to acknowledge what they'd become. Constantus stood, retrieved his weapons, and prepared for deployment. This might be the mission that finally killed him. Part of him hoped it was. Because at least death would mean the killing stopped. At least death would mean whatever remained of Tamar could finally rest. But probably not. Probably he'd survive this mission and the next and the next. Probably he'd keep killing for another century or more. Keep being a weapon. Keep existing in this state between human and machine where nothing felt real except the violence. That was the real horror of being an Astartes. Not the transformation. Not the conditioning. But the realization that you'd been turned into something that couldn't even die properly. Something that would just keep killing until the galaxy ran out of enemies or you finally made a mistake big enough to end you. 100 years after transformation. The seeds of heresy. Brother Constantus had been a space marine for a century. Had served in 7 different war zones. Had killed so many enemies that the exact count had become meaningless. Had done everything the Imperium asked of him without question or hesitation. And now he was beginning to understand why brothers turned traitor. Started small. Just thoughts. Observations. Things the conditioning should have suppressed but somehow didn't. Like noticing that most of their enemies were just people. Desperate people. Scared people. People who'd turned to chaos or Xenos or rebellion because the Imperium had failed them. Like realizing that heretic often just meant anyone who questions. That traitor meant anyone who stopped following orders. That corrupted meant anyone who wasn't willing to die for an empire that viewed them as expendable. Like understanding that maybe the Imperium wasn't actually worth defending. That maybe a system built on suffering and oppression and the systematic transformation of children into weapons was itself the evil they were supposed to be fighting. These thoughts were dangerous, heretical, the kind of thinking that got warriors executed or mind-wiped or sent on suicide missions. But Constantus couldn't stop thinking them, because something in his conditioning was breaking down. Something in his psycho-indoctrination was failing. And the more he saw, the more he questioned whether he'd been serving the right side. The mission that changed everything was supposed to be simple. Suppress a worker rebellion on a forge world. Standard operation. Kill the ringleaders. Restore order. Return to base. Except when they arrived, Constantus saw why the workers were rebelling. Children working 16-hour shifts in foundries. Families living in conditions worse than his chapter's servitors. People dying from preventable injuries because the mechanicus couldn't be bothered to implement basic safety measures. The workers weren't rebelling because of chaos corruption. They were rebelling because they were being worked to death. Because the Imperium viewed them as replaceable components. Because living under imperial rule was literally worse than dying in rebellion. Target the primary assembly hall. The mission commander ordered. Maximum civilian casualties. Make an example. Show them what happens when workers refuse to meet quota. Constantus stared at the assembly hall on his tactical display. 3,000 workers inside. Men, women, children. Not corrupted. Not armed. Just exhausted people who dared to ask for basic humanity. Sir, Constantus said carefully. Mission parameters indicate suppression of military targets. The assembly hall is civilian infrastructure. The assembly hall is where the rebellion organized. Therefore, it's a military target. Execute the order, brother. Constantus looked at his bolter, at the weapon that had killed thousands of enemies over his century of service, at the tool he'd used without question because questioning was heresy. And he made a choice. The first real choice he'd made since being transformed. No. The word hung in the vox like poison. What did you say, brother? I said no. I will not fire on unarmed civilians. This isn't suppressing rebellion. This is mass murder. You're refusing a direct order? Yes. The silence was absolute. Every Marine in the squad had heard. Every warrior was waiting to see what happened when someone said the word you weren't allowed to say. The mission commander's voice was cold. Brother Constantus, you are relieved of duty. Report to the chaplain immediately for disciplinary action and reconditioning. Your refusal to follow orders indicates corruption. Possibly heretical thought patterns. 2 brothers moved to restrain him. Constantus didn't resist. Allowed himself to be escorted away while the rest of the squad executed the mission. While 3,000 workers died to prove a point about imperial authority. In the ship's brig, waiting for judgment, Constantus finally understood what he'd become. Not a hero, not a defender, but a tool of oppression. A weapon pointed at anyone who questioned the system. A killer who'd spent a century enforcing imperial tyranny while pretending it was righteous. The chaplain arrived 6 hours later. You refused an order. Yes. You questioned imperial authority. Yes. You failed in your duty as an Astartes. No. Constantus met the chaplain's gaze. I succeeded in being human. Even after everything you did to strip that away. Even after a century of conditioning and violence. I remembered that some things are wrong. That some orders shouldn't be followed. That being a weapon doesn't mean abandoning conscience. Conscience is weakness. Conscience is failure. We are beyond such limitations. Are we? Or did you just program us to believe that? Did you condition us to think that abandoning our humanity makes us better when really it just makes us complicit? The chaplain studied him for a long moment. You're corrupted. The conditioning has failed. We'll attempt reconditioning, but your patterns suggest deep-seated deviation. You may need to be terminated and your gene seed harvested. Do what you need to do, but you should know something. Constantus leaned forward. I'm not the only one questioning. I've talked to other brothers. Quietly, carefully, and we all feel it. This sense that maybe we're serving the wrong cause. That maybe becoming Astartes didn't make us heroes. It made us monsters. That's heresy. That's honesty. And maybe honesty is what you should fear most. Because if enough of us start admitting what we've become, what we've done, your whole system collapses. Your endless supply of weapons starts refusing to kill. Your angels start remembering they used to be human. The chaplain activated his vox, called for additional security, for apothecaries, for mind-wipe preparation, and Constantus sat calmly, accepting whatever came next, because at least he'd finally done something right. At least he'd finally remembered that before being a weapon, he'd been a person. And persons had the right to say no, even if it cost them everything. Constantus was reconditioned. They didn't execute him, didn't harvest his gene seed. Instead, they rebuilt his mind, stripped away the doubt, reinforced the conditioning, suppressed the memories that had led him to question. Took 3 months. 3 months of intensive hypno-indoctrination, chemical reconditioning, psychological reconstruction, breaking down what he'd become and rebuilding it according to proper specifications. When they were done, Brother Constantus was a loyal servant of the Imperium again. Followed orders without question, killed without hesitation, functioned perfectly as a weapon. But something remained, deep in his consciousness, buried beneath layers of new conditioning, a memory of refusing, of choosing humanity over duty, of saying no. It was small, barely there, just a flicker of awareness that he'd once been something other than a killing machine. But it was enough, because memories like that don't die easily. They wait, they persist. And sometimes, when the conditioning weakens or the situation becomes extreme enough, they resurface. Constantus served another 30 years after reconditioning, fought in dozens more battles, killed thousands more enemies, did everything the Imperium demanded. And then, during a mission that required executing civilian refugees for potential corruption, the memory returned. He remembered refusing before, remembered choosing humanity, remembered that he'd once had the courage to say no. And he said it again. No. This time, they didn't recondition him. This time, the chaplain just looked at him with something like sadness. You're broken, brother. The conditioning can't hold anymore. You've seen too much, questioned too deeply. We can rebuild your mind again, but it'll just break faster next time. Then what happens to me? You'll be assigned to a penitent crusade, sent to fight in the most dangerous war zone we can find. You'll die in battle, and your death will be recorded as glorious sacrifice. And maybe, in dying, you'll finally find peace. Constantus accepted this, because death was preferable to being reconditioned again. Death meant the killing finally stopped. Death meant whatever remained of Tamar could finally rest. They sent him to face a demon incursion, a suicide mission. No backup, no support, just one broken Astartes against the legions of chaos. He lasted 4 hours, killed 87 demons before they finally brought him down. As he lay dying, his armor breached, his organs failing, Constantus felt something he hadn't felt in over a century. Relief. Relief that it was finally over. That the transformation and conditioning and endless killing had reached an end. That whatever came next, Emperor's grace or oblivion or damnation, it had to be better than what he'd been living. His last thought wasn't a prayer, wasn't a battle cry, wasn't anything the propaganda said Space Marines thought as they died. His last thought was simple, human, the kind of thought that proved whatever they'd done to him, they'd never completely killed the boy named Tamar. I'm free. Then the darkness took him, and the horror finally ended. Epilogue. The truth. The Imperium will tell you that Space Marines are heroes, angels of death, the Emperor's finest warriors. They'll show you propaganda images of noble warriors defending humanity, of transhuman champions standing against the darkness, of glory and honor and heroic sacrifice. They won't tell you about the boys who get transformed, about the surgeries and conditioning and psychological destruction required to create those heroes. They won't tell you about the decades of killing that breaks even enhanced minds. About the brothers who start questioning whether they're serving the right cause. About the warriors who remember being human and can't reconcile that with what they've become. They won't tell you that most Space Marines die not in glorious battle, but in quiet desperation. Broken by a century of violence. Worn down by conditioning that eventually fails. Destroyed by the realization that they've spent their lives serving a system that views them as disposable weapons. The truth is that Space Marines aren't heroes. They're victims. Children stolen from families. Boys transformed into weapons. Humans reconstructed into tools that can't remember why they agreed to this. And the real horror isn't the enemies they fight. It's what they had to become to fight them. It's the slow death of everything human. The gradual realization that you've been turned into something that only exists to kill. That's what the propaganda doesn't show. That's what the Imperium doesn't want you to know. Because if people understood what really happens to those boys, if they saw the surgical horror and psychological destruction and complete loss of humanity, they might stop volunteering. They might realize that becoming a Space Marine isn't a reward. It's a life sentence. Dressed up as glory, packaged as honor, sold as heroism, when really it's just a particularly cruel way to die. Slowly, over decades, until nothing remains of who you were except a weapon wearing your face. End of script. Final call to action. So here's what I need from you in the comments. After hearing all of this, the surgeries, the conditioning, the psychological destruction, the loss of humanity, would you still volunteer to become a Space Marine? Be honest. Not would it be cool or I'd love the power. Would you actually let them do this to you? Let them cut you open 19 times over 7 years? Let them chemically rewire your brain until you can't remember who you were. Let them turn you into a weapon that exists only to kill until something finally kills you? Because that's the real question. That's what the propaganda never asks. Would you pay that price? Would you trade your humanity for transhuman capabilities? Would you let yourself be transformed into something that barely qualifies as alive? Drop your answer. Explain your reasoning. Because this isn't academic. This is what the Imperium demands from millions of boys across the galaxy every single day. And maybe, just maybe, if enough people admit they wouldn't volunteer, we can start acknowledging what Space Marines really are. Not heroes, but victims of a system that eats children and spits out weapons. Hit that like button if this made you see Space Marines differently. Subscribe if you want more brutal honesty about the 40K universe. And share this with someone who thinks being an Astartes would be awesome. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, maybe the most horrifying thing isn't the enemies humanity faces. Maybe it's what humanity does to its own children to create warriors capable of facing them. But Constantus's story isn't unique. It's not even rare. Across the Imperium, on 1,000 different worlds, in 100 different chapters, the same pattern repeats. Boys become aspirants. Aspirants become Astartes. Astartes serve. Astartes break. Astartes die. And nobody talks about the ones who break. The warriors who survive the transformation but can't survive what comes after. The brothers who make it through centuries of conditioning only to discover that the human part, the part they thought was gone, was just buried. Waiting. Growing stronger in the dark places where the hypno-indoctrination couldn't reach. Let me tell you about some of them. Battle Brother Nathanos of the Raven Guard served for 206 years before the dreams started. That shouldn't have been possible. The catalepsian node prevented normal REM sleep. Space Marines didn't dream. They couldn't dream. Their brains literally weren't allowed to enter the states where dreams occurred. But Nathanos dreamed anyway. At first, they were fragments. Disjointed images that felt like memories but couldn't be. A woman's face. A child's laughter. The smell of cooking food in a small hab unit. Things that had no place in an Astartes' consciousness. He reported them to the chaplain as protocol demanded. The chaplain ordered additional conditioning, reinforced the neural blocks that prevented dreaming, assured him the issue would resolve. It didn't resolve. It got worse. The dreams became more coherent, more detailed, more real. Nathanos started dreaming about a life he couldn't remember living, about a mother who used to sing to him, about a younger sister who'd cried when the chapter took him, about a father who'd tried to hide him because he knew what becoming an aspirant really meant. None of it was in his official records. According to chapter documentation, Nathanos had been orphaned. No family, no ties, just another feral world child pulled from obscurity and elevated to glory. But the dreams insisted otherwise, showed him memories the conditioning should have erased, showed him a childhood that officially never existed. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on duty, but the dreams bled into his waking hours. He'd be in the middle of combat and suddenly smell his mother's cooking, would be cleaning his bolter and hear his sister's voice, would be standing in formation and feel his father's hand on his shoulder. The chaplain diagnosed it as genetic memory corruption, said the gene seed was somehow accessing ancestral patterns, recommended immediate reconditioning before the issue spread. But before they could begin the procedure, Nathanos did something unthinkable. He researched his own origins, hacked chapter records, a crime punishable by death, and found the truth. He'd had a family, a real family who'd loved him. The chapter had taken him by force. His father had resisted. His father had died resisting. And the chapter had altered the records to make it seem like Nathanos had come willingly, like he'd been an orphan with nothing to lose. They'd stolen him, killed his father, erased his history, and then spent decades conditioning him to forget it ever happened. Nathanos requested an audience with the chapter master, was denied. Requested access to planetary records from his homeworld, was denied. Requested permission to contact his surviving family members, his mother and sister, who he now knew were still alive. That request was treated as evidence of corruption. They reconditioned him, wiped his memory of the research, reinforced the false narrative, made him forget he'd ever had a family. But the dreams didn't stop. And 6 months later, during a routine patrol, Nathanos simply walked away from his squad, deserted, vanished into the underhive of whatever world they were defending. The chapter declared him a traitor, sent kill teams, never found him. Some say he's still out there somewhere, a lone Astartes trying to remember who he was before they took it all away. Others say he died in the underhive, killed by the very enemies he'd spent 2 centuries fighting. Either way, he chose freedom over service, chose the desperate hope of recovering his humanity over the certainty of remaining a weapon. And the chapter never spoke his name again. Apothecary Helvin had a perfect record, 143 years of loyal service, exemplary performance, 0 disciplinary incidents, the kind of Marine every chapter wanted, until he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. It happened during a routine gene seed harvest operation. Helvin and his team were processing aspirants who'd failed their initial implantation. 12 boys, ages 10 to 13, all of them experiencing catastrophic rejection of the progenoid glands. Standard protocol: terminate them, harvest any usable genetic material, recycle the remains. Helvin had done this hundreds of times. It was necessary. Not every body could accept the gene seed. The failures had to be processed so their resources could be used elsewhere. But this time, one of the boys was still conscious. He shouldn't have been. The sedatives should have kept him under. But something in his neurochemistry was resistant. He was awake, aware, watching as Helvin prepared the extraction equipment. "Please," the boy whispered. "I don't want to die." Helvin paused. In a century of harvesting failures, he'd never had one speak to him, never had one beg. The protocols assumed they'd all be unconscious. That termination would be clinical, painless, mercy in its way. "I tried so hard," the boy continued. Blood leaked from his eyes, a symptom of gene seed rejection. "I wanted to be like you, wanted to serve the Emperor. Why didn't it work?" "Your body rejected the implants," Helvin heard himself say. "It's not your fault. Some genetics simply aren't compatible. So I die? Just like that? Because my genetics are wrong. Yes, that's not fair." "No," Helvin admitted. It's not fair. The boy tried to sit up. Failed. His body was already shutting down, poisoned by organs that should have enhanced him but were instead killing him. Will you remember me? After I'm gone. And that's when something in Helvin broke. Because the honest answer was no. He wouldn't remember. None of them would. The boy would become a notation in a file. Sample 4792. Failed integration, genetic incompatibility, terminated and processed. Another statistic in the chapter's endless recruitment cycle. But the boy deserved more than that. Deserved to be remembered as a person. As someone who'd tried and failed through no fault of his own. Yes, Helvin lied. I'll remember you. What was my name? Helvin checked the file. Jaren. Your name was Jaren. Thank you for using it. The trainers stopped using our names after the first week. Just called us by numbers. Like we weren't people anymore. The boy's breathing was getting shallower. Will you tell my mother? Tell her I tried? That I wanted to make her proud. Your mother doesn't know you're here. Aspirants are taken without family notification. It's better that way? Jaren smiled weakly. So she thinks I'm still alive somewhere? Or does she know I'm probably dead? Helvin didn't answer, because the truth was worse than either option. Recruitment records showed that Jaren's entire family had been relocated after his selection. Standard procedure for aspirants from civilized worlds. Couldn't risk families asking questions or demanding their children back. Relocated usually meant processed into servitors. The chapter couldn't have witnesses. I'm scared, Jaren whispered. Is that okay? Can I be scared? Yes, you can be scared. Fear is human. You're allowed to be human. Even though I failed to become more than human? Especially because of that. Jaren died 2 minutes later. Helvin performed the harvest. Collected the few usable genetic samples. Processed the remains according to protocol. But he did something else too. Something that could have gotten him executed. He accessed Jaren's file. Found the boy's homeworld. Found records of his family. Found evidence that yes, they'd been processed into servitors. Mother, father, 2 younger siblings. All converted into mindless automatons because their son had been selected for the trials. And Helvin started tracking it. Started keeping personal records of every failed aspirant. Every boy who died in training. Every casualty of the transformation process that didn't result in a functional Astartes. The numbers were staggering. For every Space Marine successfully created, approximately 12 aspirants died. Some during surgery, some during training, some during the psychological conditioning that pushed them too hard and broke their minds. 12 dead children per Marine. Multiply that across 1,000 chapters recruiting constantly for 10,000 years. Billions. Billions of children fed into a system that killed most of them and transformed the survivors into weapons. Helvin compiled his research, presented it to the chapter master, suggested maybe, just maybe, there were better ways, more ethical ways, ways that didn't require processing 12 children like industrial materials to produce one weapon. The chapter master thanked him for his diligence, commended his thoroughness, and then had him executed for heresy. Because suggesting the recruitment process was flawed implied the Emperor's design was imperfect. And that was unforgivable. Helvin's last words, recorded by the execution detail, were simple. Remember their names. Someone should remember their names. Nobody did. His research was purged. His findings destroyed. And the recruitment continued exactly as it always had. 12 dead children per Marine. Because efficiency mattered more than ethics. Because weapons were more important than the children destroyed to create them. Castellan Drask of the Black Templars served for 370 years before he realized what he was. Not an Astartes. Not a warrior. A monster. The realization came during a crusade against a suspected heretic world. Standard operation. Orbital bombardment. Ground assault. Purge the guilty. Secure the location. Except when they landed, Drask discovered the heresy was manufactured. An administratum error had flagged the wrong world. The actual heretic planet was 2 systems over. This world, the one they just virus-bombed, killing 17 billion people, had been loyalist, faithful, following every Imperial decree. They just murdered an entire planet by accident. The Crusade commander's response: regrettable but necessary. Can't waste resources reversing course. We'll mark it as enemy casualties and move on. 17 billion people. Loyal Imperial citizens. Dead because of a filing error. And nobody cared. Nobody paused. Nobody acknowledged that maybe, possibly, this was something worth feeling bad about. That's when Drask understood. The Imperium didn't just tolerate atrocities. It required them, built them into the system, made them so routine that even killing an entire planet by mistake was just another day's work. And Space Marines were the enforcement arm of that system. The weapons pointed at anyone who questioned it. The killers who made sure the machine kept running no matter how many innocents got ground up in its gears. Drask spent 3 days in his quarters, reviewing his service record. 370 years. 490 major engagements. An estimated 7 million enemies killed. How many of those enemies had been like the civilians on that world? How many had been guilty only of being in the wrong place? How many had died because someone made an error and nobody wanted to admit it? He couldn't know. The records didn't track it. Didn't care. Dead was dead, and motivation didn't matter. Drask emerged from his quarters changed. Not corrupted, the chaplains checked. Not broken, he still functioned perfectly. But different. Aware of what he was in a way that made continued service unbearable. He requested assignment to a penitent crusade. The chaplain asked why. Drask told him the truth. Because I need to die fighting something actually evil. Need to know that at least once, my violence served a righteous purpose. Need to believe I'm more than just a weapon pointed at whoever the Imperium designates as enemy. The chaplain assigned him to hunt a demon prince. Alone. No support. No backup. A suicide mission disguised as penance. Drask accepted it gladly. Because death was preferable to continuing to serve a system he'd finally seen clearly. Death was better than spending another century killing on command without questioning whether the targets deserved it. He found the demon prince 3 months into the hunt. The creature was ancient, powerful, had killed dozens of Astartes over the millennia. But Drask had something the others hadn't. Nothing left to lose. He fought without fear because he welcomed death. Fought with desperate fury because he needed to prove that at least once, at least in this final battle, his violence mattered. He killed the demon prince. Took 4 hours. Cost him both legs, his left arm, and most of his internal organs. But he killed it, banished it back to the warp. And then he lay there, bleeding out, and felt something he'd never felt before. Peace. Not from accomplishment. Not from victory. But from finally doing something unambiguously right. Finally killing something that actually needed killing. His last Vox transmission, picked up by a passing patrol ship. Tell them I died well. Tell them I served with honor. But don't tell them the truth. Don't tell them I spent 370 years killing for a system that murdered 17 billion people by accident and didn't care. Let me be remembered as a hero. Someone should get to be a hero, even if it's a lie. They granted his wish. Drask was commemorated as a great warrior. His sacrifice honored. His name added to the chapter's roll of glory. And nobody mentioned that he died trying to atone for centuries of being exactly what the Imperium made him. A killer efficient enough that even his doubts couldn't stop him from murdering millions. These stories aren't exceptions. They're not anomalies or isolated cases of corruption. They're the norm. Hidden beneath propaganda and honor codes and ritual. But talk to any Astartes who's served long enough, who's seen enough, who's killed enough, and you'll find the same pattern. Doubt. Questioning. The slow realization that maybe becoming a space marine wasn't ascension. Maybe it was descension. A fall from humanity into something that could kill without conscience. The Imperium knows this. The chapter masters know this. That's why the conditioning is so intensive. Why the hypno-indoctrination never stops. Why brothers who start questioning are quickly reconditioned or eliminated. Because if too many space marines started asking whether they served the right cause, whether their violence was justified, whether the children they'd been were murdered for a worthy purpose, the entire system would collapse. The Adeptus Astartes depends on warriors not thinking too deeply, not questioning too much, not remembering that they used to be human and maybe, possibly, that was better than what they became. When the Imperium recruits, they show videos of Space Marines in battle. Glorious, powerful, unstoppable. They make it look like becoming an Astartes is the greatest honor a boy can achieve. They don't show the operating tables, the decades of surgery, the psychological destruction, the chemical rewiring of your brain until you can barely remember being human. They don't show the brothers who break, who start questioning, who realize they've spent centuries killing for a system that views them as disposable weapons. They don't show the suicide missions, the penitent crusades, where warriors who ask too many questions get sent to die. The reconditioning chambers where brothers who remember their humanity get mind-wiped back into compliance. They don't show that the average Space Marine serves for maybe a century before something breaks. Before the conditioning fails or the humanity resurfaces or the weight of accumulated violence becomes unbearable. They don't show that most Astartes don't die gloriously in battle. They die quietly, alone, broken by a system that used them up and discarded them when they stopped functioning properly. And they definitely don't show the children, the 12 failures for every success, the boys who die screaming on operating tables, the aspirants who break during training, the families who never know what happened because the Imperium erased them to eliminate witnesses. That's the real cost of the Adeptus Astartes. Not the obvious cost, the resources and time and training, but the human cost. The children destroyed, the warriors broken, the humanity stripped away in the name of creating weapons efficient enough to keep the Imperium alive. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming a Space Marine. You don't choose it. Yes, there are trials. Yes, you have to prove yourself worthy. Yes, you technically volunteer. But you're 10 years old, maybe 12. A child who doesn't understand what they're agreeing to, who thinks being a Space Marine means glory and honor and heroism, who doesn't know it means decades of surgical horror, psychological destruction, chemical reconditioning, the systematic erasure of everything you are so something else can be built in your place. And once the process starts, you can't stop it. Can't change your mind. Can't say, actually, this is worse than I thought. I'd like to go home now. You either become an Astartes or you die trying. Those are the only options. And most choose death, not deliberately, but because their bodies reject the modifications. Because the surgeries fail. Because the conditioning breaks their minds. 12 dead for every success. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual ratio. So when the Imperium asks for volunteers when they show up on worlds and recruit aspirants, they're not really asking. They're taking children who don't understand what they're agreeing to, processing them through a system that kills most of them and destroys the humanity of the survivors, and calling it glorious, calling it necessary, calling it service, when really it's just industrial-scale child murder dressed up as recruitment. What if we stopped? What if the Imperium decided that maybe, possibly, creating Space Marines wasn't worth the cost? That turning children into weapons, killing 12 to create one, destroying the humanity of the survivors, what if that was too high a price? What would happen? The honest answer, the Imperium would probably collapse. Space Marines are essential to humanity's defense, are some of the only warriors capable of facing the galaxy's worst threats. Losing them would mean losing worlds, sectors, maybe entire segmentums. But here's the uncomfortable question that follows. If maintaining the Imperium requires systematically destroying children to create weapons, is the Imperium worth maintaining? If the only way humanity survives is by becoming monstrous, by sacrificing its young to create killers, by building a system that views children as raw materials, then maybe humanity doesn't deserve to survive. Maybe what we call survival is actually just prolonged suicide, slowly destroying everything that makes us human in the name of fighting threats that want to destroy us. Maybe becoming like the enemy to defeat the enemy means the enemy has already won. But scattered across the Imperium in 1,000 different chapters, there are Space Marines who remember being children, being human, having families and dreams and fears that were normal rather than suppressed. They don't talk about it. Can't talk about it. Because admitting you remember humanity is admitting the conditioning failed. Is inviting reconditioning or execution. But they remember anyway. In quiet moments between battles. In the seconds before sleep when the catalepsia node hasn't fully activated. In dreams that shouldn't be possible but happen anyway. They remember mothers who loved them. Fathers who tried to protect them. Siblings who cried when the chapter took them away. They remember being more than weapons. More than tools. More than resources to be expended. They remember being human. And that remembering is dangerous. Is heretical. Is exactly what the Imperium fears most. Because if enough Space Marines remember their humanity, if enough warriors realize what was taken from them, the entire system breaks down. The weapons start refusing to kill. The angels start questioning orders. The perfect soldiers start acting like imperfect humans. And the Imperium, built on the backs of transhuman warriors who don't question, can't tolerate that. So they recondition. They execute. They send the doubters on suicide missions and replace them with fresh recruits who haven't yet realized what they've become. And the cycle continues. Children taken. Children transformed. Children destroyed. All to maintain a system that calls itself humanity's defense while systematically eliminating humanity from its defenders. If you've read this far, you understand now. Understand what Space Marines really are. What they cost. What they lose. They're not heroes. They're not angels. They're not saviors. They're victims. Children stolen and destroyed. Boys transformed into weapons. Humans reconstructed into tools that can barely remember being human. And the real tragedy isn't what happens to them. It's that we call it glorious. That we celebrate it. That we tell other children this is something to aspire to. That we maintain this system of child sacrifice and call it necessary. Call it noble. Call it service to the Emperor. When really it's just horror. Industrial-scale horror. The kind that happens when a civilization becomes so desperate that it starts consuming its own children to survive. The Space Marines are humanity's greatest weapon. But they're also humanity's greatest crime. Proof that we've become exactly what we're fighting against. Proof that maybe the Emperor's vision wasn't salvation. Maybe it was damnation. And we're all complicit in perpetuating it. Now that you know the full truth, not just the surgeries but the psychological destruction, not just the training but the systematic elimination of humanity, not just the service but the breaking of warriors who remember what they lost. I need you to answer these questions in the comments. If you had a son, and the Space Marines came to recruit him, would you let them take him? Knowing he has a 1 in 12 chance of surviving the transformation, and if he survives, he'll be psychologically destroyed and rebuilt into something that barely remembers you existed? Do you think the Imperium is justified in doing this? Is humanity's survival worth sacrificing children in this way? Or is there a point where the cost becomes too high? These aren't easy questions. There are no right answers. But they're questions we need to ask if we're going to be honest about what the Adeptus Astartes actually represents. Drop your answers below. Defend your position. Debate with others. Because this is the heart of what 40K is really about. Exploring what happens when survival demands becoming monstrous. Hit that like button if this changed how you see Space Marines. Subscribe if you want more brutally honest examinations of the 40K universe. Share this with someone who still thinks being an Astartes would be awesome. Make them confront what that actually means. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the greatest horror isn't the enemies humanity faces. It's what humanity does to its own children to create warriors capable of facing them. And whether we're willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, some costs are too high even for survival.